Cynthia Arnson is director of the Wilson Center's Latin American program, and Michael McCarthy is a research fellow at American University's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, and also a consultant to the Wilson Center's Latin American program. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Thanks. We have a classic sort of good news, bad news discussion today. We're going to talk about the latest from Colombia and the latest from Venezuela. And so let's begin with the good news. Cindy, we are close to an historic end to a more than half-century civil war. Give us the latest.
Well, there was a historic agreement at the end of June, on June 23rd, where the Colombian government and the guerrillas of the FARC signed what amounted to a ceasefire agreement. It won't be put in place until there's a final accord. There's a few minor issues that still have to be worked out. But since then, there have been any number of clouds on the horizon. One, the announcement of an important FARC front that it was not going to demobilize, that it was going to continue to fight the war, and an equally vigorous response from the government saying this is your last chance to demobilize or we will fight you to the death. And then there's also the issue of the political opposition by the former president, Alvaro Uribe, who remains very popular in the country, and the fact that if the Constitutional Court rules it in order, there will be a plebiscite on this peace deal. So there was major progress, and as everything in politics, there are a few steps forward, a few steps back.
No straight lines here.
Exactly.
But is there reason to be either optimistic or pessimistic about these details being worked out?
I think there's reason for optimism. It may not happen quite on the timeline that the government wanted, which was a signed deal by July 20th. The FARC very quickly backpedaled from setting a particular date, but I would suspect that this month or in the month of August, there will be a final agreement. There will also have to be a decision by the Constitutional Court as to whether or not the plebiscite can go forward, and that will be another important political moment for the peace talks.
Assuming the best case scenario, that it works and a final agreement is signed. I want to ask both of you on this notion, is it possible to overstate the significance of this for Colombia, that this much turmoil over this extended amount of time will be coming to an end?
Well, I think it is a historic breakthrough. It is without precedent. This is a conflict that's gone on for over half a century. It's the last remaining internal armed conflict in the Americas, and one of the few remaining actual guerrilla insurgencies in the world, other than of course what's happening in the Middle East. And that will be a historic moment for Colombia and open the possibility for lots of other things. But it by no means resolves the problems. The real question is who is going to occupy the space that the FARC had occupied around the country, and whether this provides an opening for organized crime groups or for a smaller guerrilla group, the National Liberation Army, which has not entered into these peace talks with the government.
Michael, how do you keep expectations in check at a time like this?
That's a great question. I mean, it's important to think about this really as a new chapter for Colombia, in the sense that it's the beginning or the opening of a post-conflict period. And the point there is that, there's still some elements of this conflict likely to be alive and around in Colombia for the near future. It is an historic moment for the country. I think it's a matter of first things first. There needs to be some kind of agreement in place for there to be a new path forward for thinking about how to insert these insurgencies into Colombian society, whether it be through jail or whether or not through political participation. And I think that really Colombia is going to have to deal with its long-term problems of inequality, issues of using private forms of sort of political solutions to problems via violence, and really find a way to integrate sort of the corners of the country into a full society. It's been a country that for a long time has been known as sort of having 3 city-states, and now it needs to become a full country, or a fully integrated country where there's effective sovereignty across the whole territory. And it's going to be a big challenge, but this is undoubtedly an historic moment for Colombia, and I think a step in the right direction for the country.
Is there an area that will most immediately benefit? Things like not adequate infrastructure or an education system that needs work. Are there areas in Colombia that could immediately benefit from this new environment?
Well, it certainly allows the Colombian government to focus on other things. there will need to be a very heavy security component to the post-accord era, both in terms of protecting demobilized combatants, protecting civil society activists.
What is a demobilized combatant?
Well, it's basically a member of the FARC that has agreed to lay down his or her weapons, initially goes into a concentration zone, and then after a certain amount of time is integrated through the Colombian Reintegration Agency, enters a formal process of returning to civilian life, which includes training, education, all kinds of other services and support. But after that, the fact that there is a much more peaceful country opens up economic opportunities. It makes it possible for the government to come in with a fuller set of services. These are, again, theoretical possibilities because the Colombian state has been present mostly through a security presence, through police or military, and even that, some of that is tenuous in areas of the country. So it will really be this issue, as Michael has stated, of establishing full sovereignty, a full presence of the state in both the security and the civilian aspects that will, according to many projections, open up possibilities for greater investment, for rural development, and for a different kind of society.
Yeah, another reason to be optimistic in that regard, building off of Cindy's comments, is that during the peak of the conflict between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas, there were a number of social issues that were effectively taboos in terms of being part of the normal political sort of agenda of discussion in Colombian politics. Because there was a sense in which the guerrilla groups had been the owners of these ideas of rural reform, of land reform, of social progress in these areas of the country. And I think one of the reasons really to be optimistic is that with the demobilization of these guerrilla groups, we can have a better debate in Colombia about what a new social contract can look like for the country, because it's not as though there's this question of terrorism looming over the discussion that in some ways led to a more polarized political discussion in Colombia. So that's one reason to potentially be optimistic about how you could have, I think, a better quality political debate about how to move the Colombian state and Colombian people into a situation of essentially becoming a middle-income country or a middle-class society. Colombia has all the ingredients for that. It's had stable macroeconomic policies for a long time. It's avoided a lot of the slumps that have affected other Latin American countries, and now is a big moment for it to take its next step to really become an advanced
growth, even under the circumstances.
That's right. So hopefully it can really catapult itself forward now.
Well, we shift gears from that more optimistic situation, crossing the border to Venezuela. And Michael, I'll ask you to characterize the current state of the crisis.
I think the Venezuelan government is really poised between crisis and collapse. The stakes are extremely high this year. There are real questions about whether or not the Maduro government will make it to this year's end. And the country is facing arguably its worst economic crisis in the modern era. It's experiencing what I'm beginning to call a great recession of its own. There's a chance that it's experienced 10 consecutive quarters of economic contraction. And there's a possibility this year that growth could contract almost up to 10%, which would basically place the country in a situation of depression. So it's a very severe situation. And the political opposition, though it has a great deal of momentum, because it was very successful in congressional elections last year, it doesn't really have an institutional foothold on power. And this is a big problem because there is no real balance between the opposition and the government, even though there is a great amount of public and popular support.
Some 80% would like to see Maduro out, is on the poll I saw?
There's polling that suggests that 60% of the population would like Maduro to resign now. And that tells you that any election is going to be a sort of plebiscite on his leadership. That may be a separate question from the long-term future of the Chavista political movement founded by the late Hugo Chavez. I think there is still a chance for Chavismo to be a part of Venezuelan politics going forward. But this crisis has really taken a big bite out of Chavez's legacy. In some recent polling, we found that over 50% of the population now view his legacy as essentially negative for the population and think that his model of government should be thrown away and should no longer be used for how to sort of promote national development in the country. So it's a very pivotal moment in Venezuela this year, and the big question that's on everyone's minds is whether or not there will be a recall referendum this year in 2016. The Constitution allows for it to take place this year, and it would be significant because that would immediately, assuming that the president would be recalled in such an election, that would immediately trigger a new election within 30 days. However, if the recall referendum takes place after January 10th of 2017, the current president's deputy, the vice president, an unelected position in Venezuelan politics, would step in. And that would allow Chavismo, the governing party, to still sort of shape the final 2 years of this presidential term.
Cindy, when Hugo Chavez died, you and I spoke about the future of Chavismo. And what are your thoughts now? Is this the death knell of that revolution and those politics?
Well, I think the revolution has pretty much collapsed before our eyes over these last months and even years. There is, in the last election, which is in December for the Legislative Assembly, the opposition won an overwhelming majority. They argue 2/3, although the electoral authorities denied them 2 seats, a handful of seats that kept them from having that 2/3 majority, which would have conferred certain constitutional powers. So it's clear that the Venezuelan population has moved away. There's probably a hard core of supporters, 20, maybe 25, even 30% of the population that is the hardcore base. But this is a country that can no longer feed its own people, that cannot provide even the most basic medical care, where people are dying of treatable illnesses, where there is widespread hunger, even if not official malnutrition, and where in numerous cities there are what amount to food riots, people raiding supermarkets and empty shelves, or hearing a rumor that there's a truck that's about to deliver rice and going over and taking it over to loot it. So it is a very desperate situation, and the real question is whether there can be a resolution without violence, or whether the regime will maintain its grip on power.
Michael, you mentioned the word collapse, from crisis to collapse, and Cindy brings up food shortages. How close are we of moving from a discussion of shortages to a discussion of widespread starvation?
I think we're not at widespread starvation yet, but the number of people reporting that they're eating less than 3 times a day has picked up month on throughout the first 6 months of 2016. Initial polling in January suggested 30% of the population were eating less than 3 times a day. That bumped up to 44%. I think it's likely to have increased recently to over 50%. And importantly, within that sort of population, the number of people eating only once a day has also moved up quite a bit, increased. But I think the question of starvation needs to be thought about separately, in the sense that whether or not people are able to sort of find food is the real problem. It's not as though people are becoming frail or completely becoming malnourished, and there's a sort of mass hunger affecting Venezuela. That, however, could develop in certain parts of the country, I think. I think at a national level that seems unlikely. Many analysts have discussed the possibility, or have suggested describing Venezuela as a failed state. I think that term is a bit misleading in this particular context, but it is the case that Venezuela is a critically weak state, and the possibility of a failed state context emerging in the context of civil conflict is very real.
I want to ask both of you to sort of think in terms of solutions. What will it take to turn things around? We have seen a bit of an uptick in oil prices that could help a little, perhaps. What are some of the other factors that are necessary either to coalesce for there to be progress, or those kind of X factors like oil prices that are beyond Venezuela's control, but maybe factors in any equation where things do start to improve?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, I'm pretty pessimistic there, in the sense that the best case scenario for the government is slightly easing the pain this year, alleviating the situation in the areas of the country that are most severely affected by this economic crisis. But I don't think there's a real possibility of a positive turnaround within the next 12 months. Even though the situation on the oil front and the oil markets is improving slightly for the Venezuelan government, I think that's going to allow them to honor their debt payments this year, but essentially they've made a trade-off there of paying their creditors and not being able to feed their population. These are the stakes in Venezuela today, where you have a country that's burned through its foreign reserves, and the chances for it making a real turnaround are very slim, because it would require a new economic model, and it would require backing off of a basically highly ideological rhetoric of about there existing an economic war against the government by the private sector. And the chances of Maduro and the Chavistas relenting on that front, to me, seem to be very slim.
So is there a chicken or the egg aspect of what comes first, the political crisis solved or the economic crisis solved?
Well, I'm not sure about the chicken or egg, but I would share Michael's pessimism, and I think that there is, through the Venezuelan constitution, a potential route towards finding a solution, which is through allowing this recall referendum to go through. But there is every indication that the institutions of government, the Electoral Council, the judiciary, that have been increasingly packed by Chavistas and do not have an independent role, are dead set against allowing that to happen. And so there have been a number of attempts at dialogue. The Pope has called for this. There are a number of Latin American presidents who are trying to broker a dialogue, but I think that it's mostly will be a tactic on the part of the government to buy time, and this just will allow the social pressures to continue to build. So I am similarly not optimistic about the short run.
The social unrest problem is by far the most pressing problem in Venezuela today. The question for the government is whether or not it's going to continue to be successful, and by successful I mean, relatively successful at preventing these food riots, as Cindy mentioned, from actually resulting in an outright rebellion. In the context of the military force, in the military, the government has been asking the armed forces to be out there repressing people who are rioting because they're hungry, not for any other reason. And many of these soldiers themselves are also hungry. They don't have great salaries. They can probably sympathize with a large segment of this population. So one could imagine a situation in which eventually the government's request for there to be continued repression and control of these protests could eventually break down. I'm not saying that that's necessarily going to result in an escalation of the social unrest in terms of a national rebellion, but it's a powder keg, and it could blow at any time.
Well, on that ominous note, I want to thank both of you. Wealth of information and talking to us about the two situations. And since neither of these stories are going to be resolved this week, we hope we can have you back again to talk about developments as they occur. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks very much. My pleasure.